Hi, this is Stu Stover. We typically in Econ, we spend a lot of time on issues that are inflation, unemployment, all of those kind of wonderful things. But there's some other issues that are starting to show up in America, but certainly are not new ideas. And one of the things I wanted to do is look at the notion of dictatorships, authoritarian kinds of regimes. Well, why would I do that? There's so much information out there right now about the dangers of this and the sliding of democracies towards that. And it seems like we've got an interesting environment right now where we've got some people who think that the only solution for America is to become a dictatorship, to have some real powerful leader to direct us into the correct ways. Okay. And so the reason I wanted to do this is I've lived in dictatorships. So I spent 2 years in the Philippines under a dictator named Ferdinand Marcos. And he was lots of titles for him, because that's kind of what dictators do. They have lots of titles. And his wife Imelda was there. And there's all sorts of things that we saw in the 2 years that I was there, as I reflect on today, that may be troublesome kinds of issues. I also spent some time in Haiti, and I've spent time in a variety of other countries too, but Haiti was another dictatorship that was in essence a complete disaster. So in hindsight again, my sense is the dictator controlled in Haiti about as far as he could see from his palace. And so he really had very little control over the country, and the sort of anarchy that ended up emerging numerous times in Haiti. So I've seen a variety of them. And so we're going to talk about some of the negatives that I saw living in a dictatorship. And then I'm going to get a little bit here, guys, not a lot, but a little bit on, quote, good ones. And there are potentially some good examples of dictatorships that have done good things. The problem is it's hard for them to sustain that in all sorts of ways, but there are some examples on this good side. So let me start with one of the key principles of authoritarian rule is fear. And so people tend to live in fear for a whole host of reasons. I think fear is a terrible way to live, and I don't care if you're worried about criminals coming in and destroying your property or whatever. Living in fear is really not a good way to live. And when you have an authoritarian leader, that's one of the key things that almost always shows up for a variety of reasons. Well, let me just back up a little bit before I get to actually it does sort of fit this one. So one of the things that I saw in the Philippines, I was there in 1976 to 78, almost 79. Marcos was coming to the end of his reign. It happened a few years later in a public uprising that overthrew him. But let me back up. 1960, Philippines was the richest country in Asia. Let that ruminate for a second. Richer than China, richer than Japan, richer than South Korea, richer than Taiwan, richer than India. Well, what happened? Well, they went through a period in the early 60s of sort of anarchy and all sorts of awful stuff, and Marcos ends up doing a military takeover of the country, and to put some stability and some structure. And so we emphasize the notion of people wanting to feel like somebody's in charge. We want people feeling like the society is hopefully moving in a better direction. And so he filled some of those roles very early on. But one of the things that happens in a dictatorship, it is normal, not necessarily 100%, because there's some examples where this wouldn't be true, but they were enriching themselves. So Marcos, when he showed up as the dictator, he had a modest fortune. I mean, he was not wealthy as we would think of wealthy today, but he ended his reign with $3 billion in the bank. So he was being paid $3,000 a year as a salary. And that's pretty good if you can leverage $3,000 a year into $3 billion fortune. Well, the answer is he used the power of his office and he used the levers that he had available to him to enrich himself in very, very dramatic ways. So it was self, but it was also, if you're going to enrich yourself, you better enrich your friends. And so the way you got ahead in that Philippine society is you had to be a friend of Marcos. And so that was on the business side, but it was also the judiciary, it was also, all sorts of other issues. Being a friend of Marcos meant that you got all sorts of advantages monetarily and everything else. And then also, you focus on the international connections. So businesses come in and want to do business. They want to mine resources or timber or whatever the resources they're going after. And those international companies would have to do kickbacks back to the president and other key folks. Now, I saw this personally because I was at a small agricultural college in the central part of the Philippines. They had got a big grant from the World Bank to develop into a regional agricultural center. Piles of money. So, of course, Marcos took his cut. The governor of the province, who happened to be the brother of Imelda, took his cut. The president of the college took his cut. And as best I could tell, there was a pile of cement blocks and a pile of sand, and there was very little to actually accomplish what that grant was supposed to do for that college. Because everybody was, dipping their finger in the pot and taking their stuff out, whatever. So this notion is horrible. It demolishes a country. And what it did is you saw the widening gap between the haves in the Philippines and the have-nots. And there's a lot of have-nots in the Philippines. And that widened, and there wasn't nearly as much middle class as there should have been. And there wasn't as much effort to, well, this is kind of down here with last piece, but the values is what it did is it forced people to think that they couldn't get ahead by working hard. They could only get ahead by who their connections were. Is that bad for society? Yeah, absolutely. And so we watched the Philippines from an economic standpoint go from this economic level here, and they just plummeted for 30 years. And every year, less and less resources, more and more people. I mean, all sorts of issues that would show up that would be bad issues for a country like the Philippines. Japan rises, South Korea rises, Taiwan rises, Singapore rises, and eventually China rises, and the Philippines is going the other direction. Could they have maintained their spot at the richest country in Asia? It would have been tough. But what they chose just didn't work at all. So a third issue that shows up is something I'm loosely calling dissent and elections. And so typically in an authoritarian system, you don't want the press to be free. You don't want them to criticize you because, you've got lots of things they could criticize you for. And so you don't want that. Elections, I was there one time when Marcos did a referendum. Okay, it's an odd little process, but the referendum, as best I can remember, guys, was, do you like me or not? Well, he got 96% of the people in the Philippines saying, yes, we love you, you're wonderful. And he took that without thinking about what that necessarily meant. Because what are people going to say? Are they going to say, I don't like you? What's the risk? And the risk was people were disappearing. And so You typically get control over elections, and you typically want to constrain dissent. A fourth one that I would talk about is it's a rule of the minority. Now, in a democracy, we tend to think of democracy as the rule of the majority without running over the minorities. Well, in this case, and I would argue Hungary would be another example of this, rule by minorities right now, is that what you get is a minority view that imposes their will on the majority. What does the majority have for an option? Short of revolution, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to sort that one out. And so I'm always nervous about a minority imposing their will on everybody else. Now, we could talk about examples in America right now of how this works, but we're not going to go there. I want to look at some other issues. A fifth one is that dictatorships tend to be capricious and vengeful. So you look at, say, Putin right now. So Putin may have his key friends, key allies, and tomorrow they may not be. And if they're not one of their key allies tomorrow, it's astonishing how many of Putin's former allies fall out of windows or have planes blown up or other stuff. And so this notion, this commitment to being capricious, because how do you know if you're on the good side, you're on the winning team, or if suddenly you're not? And the vengeance stuff that will show up is that they have the power. They can kind of do whatever they want. A sixth one is misinformation. And so in the Philippines, I watched a complete, almost complete, approach to avoid the real truth. So we didn't have real data. And so the economics of all this stuff were really suspect because you didn't have good data. All sorts of issues with that, but kind of know what misinformation means. So let me talk about good ones for just a second. We're not going to take a lot of time here. But 1960 in South Korea was also a critical year. They had gone through political chaos, post-Korean conflict. The North Koreans went all the way down to the south part of South Korea before MacArthur pushed them all the way back to the north part of North Korea, and back and forth they went. Demolished the country, and trying to create a political system and economic system was astonishingly hard in the 1950s. So in the early 1960s, you had a military coup. A guy took over the country and he said two things. We have two priorities. We got to protect ourselves from the North, because at any point the North could invade again. And secondly, we got to grow. We got to economically grow, because the only way we can protect ourselves, we got to have enough money to be able to do that. And so the economic stuff was astonishingly important for South Korea. And so what happened is this guy said, I will not tolerate misinformation in the economic sphere. So unlike the Philippines, where there was nothing that was real data, he said, you got to have real data, because we got to develop ourselves quickly. Quickly basically meant we got to, South Korea's not that big a country, not that many people, so they had to build stuff that the rest of the world would buy, and so they could start to get some money showing up in the country so that they could buy the military equipment and all the other stuff to protect themselves, but also to continue developing. They did a remarkable job of that. And so you kind of missed some of this stuff. So you didn't have the enriching going on of the military dictator. Fear was still there, but it wasn't quite as pronounced as it typically is in most dictatorships. Rule by minority was less significant. There wasn't a lot of dissent, certainly in the early days. And so what you had in South Korea is you had more of a good dictator for a while. Why do I say for a while? Because over time, what tends to happen? Power corrupts. And I think there's a truth there that it's not always true, but to some large extent. And so what happened is the dictator got assassinated by one of his key guys. And then what happened? You had a democracy sort of emerge out of that system. And so I use South Korea as an example of a country that had some real positives with a dictatorship approach, but then they transitioned to something that we are more comfortable with. And today I would argue they've got a pretty healthy democracy. Another example of that, we go back in time, Spain in the 1930s went through a horrible revolution between the communists who wanted to have a communist regime in Spain and the royalists and the generals and the others. Well, horrible stuff. We had Americans who went and fought on both sides of that particular conflict. And so the result of that is General, I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but he won. And so he imposed a pretty harsh dictatorship. Now, in those days, there was a lot of enriching him and his friends. The country didn't economically move forward like they probably should have because of the system, all sorts of stuff. But eventually, the Spanish people threw them out and created a more reasonable democracy. And so we see Spain today being, in many ways, kind of a shining light for what a country can become despite their history and all the other stuff. And so part of what we're looking at here is it easy to overthrow a dictatorship? Well, any of you who know anything about Desert Spring, which was the Arab uprising to overthrow the old dictators and whatever, a couple countries actually made it, but most of them, they got squashed. And I don't mean in a nice way. And so it's hard to get rid of dictators once we got them. It is possible to get rid of them, but the bigger issues here is living in a dictatorship means there tend to be rather specific rules about how the game is played and how we as a society should move forward in all kinds of ways. Obviously, Hitler would be another example of a horrible one and the consequences of that. But the reality is, I'm very leery of allowing any country to slide towards dictatorships because I don't think the answers are all that great. Now, if any of you are interested, there's tons of information out there, so go dive into it and see what's going on with this issue. Thank you very much.